It's this part in the Fellowship of the Ring whenever Gimli and the rest of the Fellowship discover Balin's tomb there in the mines of Moria in Khazad-dûm. It's such a sad, poignant moment, especially in the movie and in the book, because there Gimli is realizing that part of his family, Balin being his cousin once removed, and his uncle, Oin, brother of his father, Gloin, and Ori, are now deceased. And he was expecting to see them and be welcomed by them. However, instead, he goes to find them deceased. That had to be an incredibly tragic moment for him. Some differences between the book and the movie. Of course, in the movie, whenever they go into the chamber of Mazarbul, they're expecting to go in, and at least Gimli is, to greet his family. However, once they walk into that chamber, they see that it's a tomb, and it's a place of burial. And immediately there's shock and grief that you can see whenever you look at Gimli's face within the film. Gandalf reads from the book of Mazarbul and recites what happened to Gimli's family, specifically Balin. And there in the movie, Gimli, you can see the visceral pain that he's experiencing, and he's very expressive. Gimli in the books is way more stoic and solemn, and there's a nobleness to him that we don't really see in the movie. In the book, whenever he realizes what's happened to his family and friend, he recites the Dirge in Khazad-dûm. My understanding is that would have been a secret language, or it would have been just something that the dwarves would have understood. That was a way that he could memorialize what happened to him. And so just taking a step back, whether you've read the books or watched the movies of The Hobbit, we are familiar with Balin and Oin and Ori. They were part of the ones that accompanied Gandalf and Bilbo there within The Hobbit to the Misty Mountain and ultimately to face Smaug, using Bilbo as the burglar to reclaim what they felt was rightfully theirs. So after the adventures in The Hobbit, approximately 30 years before the events in the Fellowship of the Ring, Balin, Oin, and Ori go to reestablish their community there in Moria. The reason why the dwarves had left Moria to begin with is because way back 1,008 years prior, in the Third Age, 1981, they had delved too deeply and awoke a Balrog, which, of course, when we watch the movie or we read Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, we know what happens there. And ever since then, they had fled. And then 1,008 years later, about 30 years before the events of the Fellowship of the Ring, Balin, Oin, and Ori returned back to Moria in order to reestablish their community within that place. And then 5 years after that is whenever Balin, Oin, and Ori end up losing their lives. Balin, my understanding is he went to go look at Mir, which was a sacred lake to the dwarven community. And during that time, he took an arrow from an orc archer and died. When Balin died, of course, they erected that tomb there in Mazarbul. Oin was killed that same year as Balin while attempting to flee out of the West Gate. The Watcher in the Water is who ended up killing him, that same creature that ends up attacking the Fellowship right before they rush in to the mines of Moria. And then Ori died during a last stand of the dwarves against the orcs at that time. So my understanding is by the time they would have arrived at the mines of Moria, they would have already been past probably about 25 years or so. And whenever Gimli goes there, he's fully anticipating or expecting to be welcomed and to have these familiar relationships and to have that positive experience of being able to introduce his friends to them. And that was probably a shocking thing for that to occur for him, regardless of whether it's the visceral, anguished Gimli from the movies or the more somber, stoic, but saddened Gimli in the book. And not only that, he doesn't really have time to process exactly what occurs because both in the book and in the movie, the orcs end up attacking them. One thing that happens in the movie and not in the book is where Pippin knocks down the skeleton and then, of course, creates a commotion, alerting the orcs that are there. In the book, Gandalf takes his time, slowly reads the book, finishes reading, acknowledges that they need to leave fairly quickly. Orcs are potentially in the area, and then Legolas, with his elf ears, hears them in the distance, and then, of course, they come and they attack. Whether you're in the book or in the movie, there's no time for Gimli to process what's happened. And not only that, they have another thing that occurs that is incredibly tragic, is Gandalf. He loses his life, and he falls to what they believe his death. And after all that occurs, they're just forced to soldier on and to keep moving. However, when they do go to Lothlorien, that does provide him some time And that was one thing that I wanted to speak to, at least a little bit, as far as navigating those difficulties of life. Number one, having experienced tragically losing someone that was completely unanticipated, I know that that's incredibly difficult to deal with or to navigate. And so when I read that account from Gimli, especially now, because I read that before that event occurred, but now, or when I watch that, I experience that through a different lens of seeing how difficult that had to have been. And not only that, to have to be thrust into a situation where you have to keep going. You can't really process. In my own experience, I had to keep working. I had to keep taking care of a family, and I had to keep moving forward. And it was difficult to have to deal with that really tragic thing, and yet life goes on. And so one thing that I do think that is really important is at some point in time, you do have to find your own Lothlorien. Meaning, at some point in time, you do have to slow down somewhere to reflect and to allow ample time to grieve. At least that's just my opinion, not trying to come out like a professional or anything to that effect. But I do think that it's a beautiful thing that eventually he was able to get to a place where they could take a breather and he could digest everything that he just went through and observed, and to navigate that tragic loss that he just experienced. And so within my own life, and I think perhaps if you've ever experienced that, or hopefully you never do, but if you happen to, it's important, again, to find that space to rest, like in Lothlorien. And then another thing I think of is that sometimes we can get so caught up and preoccupied in our own lives and think that perhaps people that we care about that now are moved far away, or we, for whatever reason, don't communicate with or have as much contact with anymore, that we might get caught up in the idea that, well, they're doing fine, we haven't heard from them in a while. And the reality is perhaps we might want to take an initiative and reach out and to make sure that they're okay, that they're doing all right. Not criticizing Gimli, his character, or anything to that effect, but just seeing his anticipation was that he would arrive there, be welcomed with open arms, get to fellowship with family and friends, and he thought that everything was okay, or at least that he believed that everything was going to be okay whenever he got there. However, once he arrives, he realized that things weren't okay. And I think that maybe it's just something that we can take into account, as perhaps it's good for us to reach out and not just assume that everything's doing okay with people around us. So those were just two things that I thought that perhaps that we might be able to glean from that specific account of what Gimli had to go through there in the mines of Moria. I do love the character of Gimli, both in the book and the movie, though there are significant differences between the two. And it's this part that, again, I think that is maybe more meaningful than I initially thought when I first watched it or first read it, especially having gone through something difficult, potentially in the same realm as what he did. And now when I look at that, or now when I read that, I view it differently, and I'm appreciative that he was able to get to that place in Lothlorien where he might be able to take a breather and to navigate whatever difficulties he was experiencing, having gone through something so tragic.